So the two atoms are unstable, and when they bind together through a double covalent bond, each one of them reaches the octet state and they become stable. When the molecule of oxygen is formed, which is oxygen 2, this is a stable molecule. And the more stable the molecule is, the less potential energy it possesses. So, let's wrap up this by opening a new screen and writing some facts on the screen. So let's open a new screen. So the stability of a molecule is determined by its total energy. So first of all, we can write this fact: the stability of the molecule is determined by its total energy. And we will explain this further in the next statement. The stability of the molecule is determined by its total energy. Okay? So the lowest total energy will correspond to the most stable state. So when the molecule has the lowest total energy, this means what? This means what? That it has, the molecule is the most stable, in the most stable state. This means what? This means that there is an inverse relationship between the total energy, not only the potential energy of the molecule, but there is an inverse relationship. An inverse relationship between what and what? Between the total energy of the molecule and the stability of the molecule. And this sounds logical. Another fact that we can write on the screen, and that is very important, and that is related to fact number 1, will be the following, but let's first erase. The second fact is that the conformation of the molecule is considered stable when it has the minimum potential energy. So the conformation, and that's why the two oxygen atoms, after having bonded together, will have a more stable configuration and will have the minimum potential energy. So the conformation of a molecule is considered stable, when it has, and this sounds logical because there is an inverse relationship, when it has the minimum potential energy, when it has the minimum potential energy. Okay, so these are two important factors to understand. Now, what's the relationship between the strength of the bond and the potential energy? This is the third fact we're going to write on the screen, and which is a very important fact. Weak bonds have a high potential energy, and this sounds normal. Weak bonds are rather unstable, so they have a relatively high potential energy, and vice versa. meaning that strong bonds will have a low potential energy, a relatively low potential energy. So if we compare, for example, double bonds and single bonds, double bonds will have a higher potential energy than single bonds. Now let's move on to the next concept, which is chemical energy. Chemical energy is one form of potential energy because it is the energy stored in the bonds due to the formation of the chemical bonds, meaning that this energy has been stored in the bond because each atom, say for example, we take the example of the two oxygen atoms that bonded together and that formed two covalent bonds. Of course, as we said before, now the molecule is more stable than the atom. An oxygen molecule, again, is more stable than the oxygen atom. So it has a lower potential energy, but it still has a potential energy because this bond keeps the two oxygen atoms in place. And this is because of the attraction between the positive nucleus of the oxygen atom and the negative charge on the electron. So they are forced to stay in a particular position, just like when you hold the ball and or the particle and put it above a shelf or above a hill, it is forced to stay there. So it has stored potential energy due to its new position. So the chemical energy is again a form of potential energy. So it sounds logical to say that the more bonds we have in a molecule, the greater the potential energy is. But be very cautious because this statement is partly confusing, or to a certain extent confusing. The more bonds we have in a molecule, the greater the potential energy. This is because each bond stores a certain amount of potential energy. So each bond represents a certain amount of potential energy. So the more bonds you have, the more potential energy you store. But this does not contradict what we have said before, that the total potential energy stored in the oxygen molecule is less, of course, than the sum of the potential energies of the individual atoms, because the atoms were unstable. They became more stable upon binding, so they had less, they started to have a smaller level of potential energy. So if we agree on the fact that the more bonds there are in a molecule, the greater potential energy is stored in the molecule, then a complex molecule like glucose or a fat molecule, for example, will have a huge or a bigger amount of potential and chemical energies stored in it. Now, we have another type of energy, which is thermal energy. And actually, thermal energy is heat energy, but it is totally different from temperature. And we will see that thermal energy is a measure of the energy that is transferred to a thermodynamic system or from a thermodynamic system. What is a thermodynamic system? A thermodynamic system is a space that is confined by walls, like a reservoir, like a container, like a box, like a room, like the inside of the human body. So all these spaces that are confined by walls, whether they are big, like a room, for example, or a huge container, or small, like a cell, the cell can be considered a thermodynamic system, and they are confined by walls or membranes to separate them from the surrounding. So the idea of the system is the idea of a space that is separated from the surrounding, and that space contains matter or contains radiation and has a particular permeability. So how many criteria do we have for the thermodynamic system? Number one, it should be a space. Number two, that is confined by walls to separate it from the surrounding. It should contain matter and or radiation, and it should have a defined permeability. And in such a case, the thermal energy or the heat energy is the energy that will be transferred from a body with a higher temperature, that as measured, for example, by a thermometer, to a body with lower temperature, or from a hotter body to a lower body. For example, here we have a system. Let's postpone this for a while. The thermal energy is transferred from the hotter body to the lower body. This is a fact. It is transmitted from the body to the higher temperature to the lower temperature. But why does a body have a higher temperature and why does a body have a lower temperature? If we look at that diagram, say for example that on side A, the side to the left, the container to the left, the temperature is T1. And when we write the temperature in capital, then it is in Kelvin degrees and not in Fahrenheit. And we add heat. So you add a certain amount of thermal energy, so the system acquires a higher temperature. What happened inside the system actually is that the individual molecules will gain energy and will have a higher kinetic energy, as you can see. And this, how did we know? How is a higher kinetic energy represented on the diagram? By having a longer arrow. So the longer arrow here represents that we have a kinetic energy that is greater in amount. Now, the temperature is therefore directly proportional to the kinetic energy. And the concept of temperature is different from the concept of heat energy. Heat energy and temperature are not the same. Heat is a kind of energy. Temperature is a degree, is a measure of the kinetic energy stored in the molecules, of the average kinetic energy. So the thermal energy will be transferred from where we have higher thermal energy to where we have lower thermal energy. So it will be transferred down an energy gradient, but this thermal energy is high. Why? It will be high, or it is high, because the molecules inside have a high kinetic energy, as indicated by the measurement on the thermometer, which is the temperature and which represents the average kinetic energy of the molecules. So we have the thermal energy, we have the potential energy that we have discussed before, and it is the energy stored in an object or held by an object because of its position relative to other objects or relative to the ground, or due to stresses within itself. Like, for example, when you have a helix and or a helix like this, and this is the neutral position of the helix. So if you stretch out the helix to a new position like this, then the folds of the helix have increased potential energy due to their new position and due to the stress. And the stress here is the stress due to stretching out. But on the other hand, if you compress, this is again the neutral position, this is the stretched out position. So this is the stretched out position. But if you compress it like this by moving it inwards, this is compression, and this is again stretch. So the neutral position A will have the lowest potential energy, whereas the position B and the position C, stretched out or compressed, will have a higher potential energy depending on how much the spring or we call it spring, I'm sorry, not a helix. Helix or helical form is the shape. Now, the chemical energy is the energy, of course, the potential energy can also due to a position, not due to the position of the object only, or due to the stress within the object or itself, but it might be due to its electric charge. For example, if you have two bodies, for example, a positive particle and a negative particle, suppose we have a positive particle and a negative particle, of course, they are attracted to each other. There is an electrostatic attraction force between them. But if you force them out by a method or another, then they will have potential energy because they will acquire a new position that is not their stable position or that is not their lowest energy position, and they acquire potential energy. So their potential energy, when they are stable, when they are attracted to each other, is relatively lower than the potential energy when they are far from each other. Of course, because when they are far from each other and they carry opposite charges, they will tend to move towards each other. So if you prevent them from moving towards each other, they will store this energy inside them. It's just like when you're nervous and you don't shout. So this nervousness is stored as an energy inside you. So at the proper time, if this energy is not diminished, if this anger and nervousness is not diminished, it will be released. Chemical energy is the energy stored in the bonds of the molecules, and chemical energy, as we have explained before, is one type of potential energy. The electrical energy is related to electric charges. So we have just given an example, but this one is potential energy. But if I have, for example, in an electric wire, because we have a battery, for example, to which the wire is connected, and we have a positive pole here and a negative pole. The negative pole has an excess or a surplus of electrons. So electrons will move in the wire. The movement of the electrons in the wire, this is electrical energy. And then we have the mechanical energy, and we said before that it is the sum of the kinetic energy or the energy of motion and the potential energy. We have the nuclear energy because we have inside the nucleus of the atom, not inside the nucleus of the cell, we have several protons and we have neutrons. These protons are supposed to repel each other and are supposed to be farther away from each other. But because they are contained inside the nuclear membrane, so they are forced to stay close to each other, although they are supposed to repel each other. So there is great energy that lies inside, that is stored inside the nucleus because of the presence of those similar charges in proximity with each other. So if there is nuclear fission and the nuclear membrane is fissured, these particles will release the huge energy that is stored inside the nucleus, and from there comes the nuclear energy. And then we have the light energy. Of course, you know that light consists of electromagnetic waves, and that the electromagnetic waves consist of photons, and that the photons have a dual characteristic, meaning that they have particle-like properties, but when they're forced to hit an object, for example, they lose this mass and be converted into energy. So there is energy associated with the movement of the photons. And of course, we all feel this energy in the electromagnetic waves of the light that comes, for example, from the sun. So light is a type of electromagnetic radiation that is produced by a hot object like sunlight, for example, like the electric bulbs, like lasers. And actually the heat, but there is a difference here, because when you talk about the heat energy that is associated with light, the bulb is hot because part of the light energy is converted into heat energy, just like part of the sun light energy is converted into heat energy, just like laser, which is concentrated light, because all the electromagnetic waves have the same phase and the same wavelength. So it's very concentrated energy, as you know. Of course, you all know that the electromagnetic spectrum, and we would be studying this in full detail before studying photosynthesis, it ranges from very short wavelengths, like the gamma rays, for example, to very long wavelengths, like the radio waves. And each of the different types of electromagnetic waves with their different wavelengths has a particular function. In order for a living organism to stay alive, and it needs energy. Why? Because this energy is important for two things. Maybe the concepts are understandable and easy, but the wording is a bit more complicated. So here, for example, we used to say that living organisms need a constant input of energy, and that constant input of energy, to simplify things, is through food, for example, eating food, or through being exposed, for the plants, for example, to be exposed to light. So for human beings, it is the energy that we extract from food. For plants, it is the energy extracted from sunlight, absorbed and converted into food molecules. But why do living organisms need this energy? For two main purposes. Of course, to carry out active processes. This is the easier purpose to understand, because we all know that in order for muscles, for example, to contract, they require energy and they require ATP molecules. So muscle contraction requires energy. Thinking and transfer of electric impulses in the brain and along the nerves requires energy. These are famous examples of active processes. The sodium-potassium pump, for example, that is important for all living organisms. But the new concept you're going to understand in your AP curriculum is that this energy is also important for your living system to stay organized. And when we say system, this is different from a body system. When we say a body system, and this is what we used to say before, we mean a group of organs. So a body system is nothing but a group of organs. They form a system, but like the digestive system, like the nervous system, like the renal system. But when we say a living system, the living system is, as we said before, it is a space that is surrounded by a certain boundary, not necessarily a wall, but say a boundary, whether it is a membrane or a wall or whatever else. So the word living system can apply to the whole human body, for example. It can apply to a body system, but it can also apply to an individual cell. So an individual cell can be considered a living system, but cannot be considered a body system. So in order for a living system to stay organized, this requires energy. And we will understand over the course what we mean by an organized living system. Living systems, let's first discuss all the properties of living systems, and you can apply what I'm saying to a living cell, for example. So living systems are characterized by what? They are characterized by being open And when we say open here, when you say open, for example, about a living cell, this does not mean that the cell membrane is open, but open here means interacting, means that the cell is all the time sending substances out and receiving substances, signaling to other cells, and so on. So it is an open system. The living system is open or interacting, and the living system is self-organizing, meaning that this highly organized structure and function of the cell, for example, the presence of organelles, the presence of cytoskeleton, the presence of membrane trafficking, the presence of membrane, positive and negative membrane balances, the presence of active transport on all levels, on the level of structure and on the level of function. The living cell or the living system, if it is a bigger system, are self-organizing, meaning that even when the cell commits suicide, the cell will reuse, or other cells will reuse the substances that have resulted from this suicide. So self-organizing means it has a certain pattern of structure and function. And when we say a certain pattern here, we mean structure and function, and a certain organization or order, but it is self-done, meaning that it arises from internal processes, meaning that a cell, for example, as a prototype of living systems, will depend mainly on internal biochemical reactions and processes to keep its pattern organized and constant. In order for a living system to be maintained, to stay open to interaction and self-organized, it requires flow. Flow of what? Flow of material. This sounds normal. The cell requires, for example, to uptake oxygen, to uptake water, to give out carbon dioxide, to give out waste products, and so on. But it also requires the flow of info. And this is what we have seen and explained in the signaling processes of the cell. The cell can signal itself. The cell can signal nearby cells in remote signaling. The cell can signal other far or distant cells in distant signaling. This is what we call flow of information. And the flow of information also includes the internal flow of information. For example, when you have seen that certain internal receptors can bind with steroid hormones and can circulate inside the cytosol to reach the nuclear membrane and then bind with a receptor on DNA. All this is flow of not only flow of matter, but flow of matter that means information to the cell. And of course, in order for the flow of matter or some types of flow of matter to occur and some types of flow of information to occur, we need the flow of energy. Why do we say flow of energy? Why don't we say simply energy? Because flow of energy will mean that there is an intake of energy, like absorption of light waves by plants, for example, or it might be getting rid of the surplus of energy, or it might be the internal transfer of energy from a part of the living system to another part. So it's actually a dynamic flow of energy. Any biological system or living system will exhibit or show or display different forms of transformation of energy from one form to another. For example, in green plants, for example, you can see that the light energy from the sun will be transformed into a potential energy or chemical energy in the bonds of glucose. And all the time, while studying the amazing inside of a living cell, we are going to see these types of transformation of energy or living systems in general, not necessarily a living cell, because the greater or the bigger the biological system, the more you can see these transfers of energy. And here it's high time to postulate the first or to mention or to state the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is also called the law of conservation of energy, because it's mainly explaining that it's not because you are transforming energy from one form of energy to the other form that you will lose some energy. No, energy is neither created nor destroyed. You cannot create energy from nothing, and you cannot destroy energy and make it nothing, but it is transformed from one type to another. Even, for example, in the electric bulb, when you give electricity to the lamp and the lamp gives you light energy, there is some heat that is dissipated. Part of the electrical energy has been converted into heat energy, but that energy hasn't been lost. It has been dissipated to the environment, so you feel the lamp hot, and you might, if you're sitting next to a big lamp, feel heat, but the heat is there. It hasn't been lost. It adds to the heat of the environment, and we will be talking about this very soon. Again, the second law of thermodynamics states what? We've just said that energy can be converted from one type to another, like the electric energy in the electric bulb that has been converted to not only light energy, but to heat energy. So the electric bulb converts electric energy mainly into light energy, but partly into heat energy. So there is conservation of energy, because the total electric energy that reached the electric lamp is equal to the light energy plus the heat energy. But the second law of thermodynamics states what? Because of that small heat that is dissipated, sometimes dissipated during the processes of heat conversion, the second law of thermodynamics states that during these processes of energy conversions, the universe becomes more disordered and entropy increases. Entropy is measure of the disorders that can occur in a system. So because these energy conversions are related to heat dissipation, and because this heat will increase the kinetic energy of the molecules around the system, so this seems to increase disorder in the surrounding environment, and this is what we call entropy. So what is entropy? Entropy is a measure of the disorder of a system, or the energy that is unavailable to do work. And actually, the best example of energy that is unavailable to do work is heat energy, because the dissipated heat energy. If you have dissipated heat energy that is dissipated, because you can sometimes use the heat energy to do work. For example, if you have, for example, a pot of tea, and you're putting it on any kind of heat, so after a while, this heat energy will force the water molecules to increase their kinetic energy and be converted into vapor, and you will find that the cover of the teapot will be moving upwards and downwards. So this is the power of steam to move things. So, but if we're talking about heat that is dissipated is not held in our hands, is not available to do work. So as I've just said, the energy unavailable to do work is heat energy, but it's not all heat energy. This doesn't mean that all types of heat energy are not allowed to do work, but there is certain amount of heat, part of the heat energy, that is unavailable to do work. So here We can give the example of a solid, a liquid, and a gas. As you know, that a solid has small intermolecular spaces and strong intermolecular forces. And then when you give it heat energy, then the liquid molecules will go further apart and will become far from each other, and the intermolecular forces between them will decrease. And then in the case of a gas, you have the highest intermolecular, sorry, you have the highest intermolecular forces, and you have the highest intermolecular distances, and you have the lowest intermolecular forces. And of course, you can deduce easily that a gas is the most disordered and the least organized of the three systems. So during every energy transformation process, for example, the transformation of light solar energy into chemical energy, some energy is lost as heat. And the lost heat is an unusable form of energy. Notice here that we said the lost heat, not any kind of heat, the heat that is dissipated. And why exactly is the heat that is dissipated not available to do work? Because it is dissipated in an unorganized way. It's not, we are not capable of catching it to do work. So it cannot be retrieved, of course, and it cannot be transformed to another type of energy. That's why there are certain scientists that think that the world is all the time in an increasing state of entropy, as status of entropy, and this might mean that the world is expanding in volume. Now, Gibbs free energy, which we denote as G, is the energy that is available to do work. So the Gibbs free energy is exactly the opposite of the lost energy, heat energy that is related to entropy. So Gibbs free energy is the energy available to do thermodynamic work. What is thermodynamic work? Thermodynamic work is work related to transfer of energy from one system to another. So whenever you have energy that is transferred from one system to another, then there is available energy or usable energy, and that is Gibbs free energy. But this should be at constant temperature. So Gibbs free energy, again, is the energy that is available to do work within a biological system, but it does work at a constant temperature. And we will be explaining this very soon. Now, why are we saying or specifying that in the definition of Gibbs free energy at a constant temperature? Because if you go deeper into the study of Gibbs free energy, you will find out that when you increase temperature, Gibbs energy does not necessarily increase. Gibbs energy will either increase or decrease depending on the type of entropy that occurred upon increasing the temperature. Of course, this is a higher level of difficulty that I don't think will be covered or that I don't think will not be included in the questions on Gibbs free energy. So during the course of it, because we are discussing Gibbs free energy in a very superficial way, actually. So during the course of a chemical reaction, we all know that if energy is released, the reaction is said to be exergonic or exothermic. And by convention, the change in Gibbs free energy is considered negative. Why is the change in Gibbs free energy considered negative? because the energy of the products in an exergonic reaction is lower than that of the reactants. For example, if you have substance A that is broken down into substance B plus C, and there is release of energy, so the reaction is exothermic or exergonic, then definitely the total energy of the products B and C is lower than the energy of the substrate A. So because it is lower, then we consider the change in Gibbs free energy a negative change. So all exothermic reactions are considered having a negative delta G or change in Gibbs free reaction. In an exothermic reaction, you know that the reactants have a higher potential energy than the products. And since they are more or they have more potential energy, then they are considered more unstable because they have an excess energy or surplus energy that's waiting to be released in order to form a more stable compound with a lower energy state. That's why because of this introduction we have just explained, those reactions are spontaneous. Why are they spontaneous? Because the reactant is already unstable. It is eager to start the chemical reaction. It does not need you to give more energy to start the reaction. It is already having more energy than needed. So the reaction is spontaneous. It occurs on its own. It requires minimal activation energy or even no activation energy. And the conditions of the reactions favor the formation of the products. Why? Because we all know that living organisms and molecules and everything in this life tends to have lower energy, to be more stable, to have lower entropy, to have a lower energy status, or what we call lower enthalpy. So what is enthalpy? Enthalpy is is the energy status of a molecule or a system. So exothermic reactions are spontaneous, occurring on their own, requiring minimal activation energy, and the conditions of the exothermic reaction, or the conditions of actually the substrate, favor the occurrence of the reaction, the forward procedure of the reaction, because there is tendency to go towards lower energy status or a lower energy status or lower enthalpy. What is enthalpy? Enthalpy is the energy status. But if we want to translate this into quantities, numerical values, so the enthalpy that is denoted H actually is the internal energy of the molecules plus PV in joules. PV of the system, the volume and the pressure of the system, the product of the pressure and the volume of the system. So this is enthalpy. So enthalpy is equal to, but we never give you problems on enthalpy. This hasn't occurred before. Internal energy, which is actually a potential energy plus mechanical energy plus PV, or the product of the pressure and the volume of the system. Um, If in a chemical reaction, on the other hand, the energy is absorbed, the reaction is considered endergonic or endothermic, and in such a case, the potential energy of the products is more than the potential energy of the reactants, and Gibbs free energy is considered positive. So it's all positivity and negativity are related to the product energy. If the product energy is more than the reactant energy, which is the case here in endothermic reactions, because you will have the reactant A plus energy gives you the products B plus C. So definitely the total energy of B plus C is higher than that of A, and this is an endothermic reaction. And because here is higher, the side of the products, we consider delta G or Gibbs free energy to be positive. Endergonic reactions, unlike exergonic reactions, of course, require activation energy to start the chemical reaction, because the reactant actually has a very or a relatively lower energy than the products. So they need a much higher activation energy to start. And now there is an important question to ask, which is how do living cells manage their energy resources? You will always find along the course that in cellular reactions, as we've seen before, there are pathways of chemical reactions, and that some of them are very complex, and that, for example, you will see this clearly in cellular respiration and in photosynthesis. You will see that there is coupling of endergonic reactions with exergonic reactions, meaning that, and that sounds logical, because exergonic reactions release energy, and that released energy will power endergonic reactions, which themselves require an activation energy. So the energy released by exergonic reactions will be considered activation energy for endergonic ones. And therefore, this is a famous, of course, statement. And I think that the readers of your exam answers at the end of the day would love to read this. Energy releasing processes drive energy storing processes. And the best example is exergonic reactions power endergonic ones. So you can say exergonic reactions power endergonic ones, or you can just say energy releasing processes drive energy storing processes. We will stop here, and then we will continue in the second video. We will be talking about the graphs that represent what we have explained on exergonic reactions and endergonic reactions.